He came to town for a cow until a little girl whispered, "They're hanging my innocent mama at dawn." The dust-choked town of Redemption was a place that exuded pious self-righteousness, vulture-like greed, and a hushed, simmering cruelty. Sam McCoy leaned against a hitching post, his hat pulled low. He wasn't here for the grim spectacle, just the livestock. A fine Jersey cow cheap, a square deal. His gaze was a mask of practiced indifference as Sheriff Kane, a man who wore his authority like a shroud, auctioned off the last remnants of a broken woman's life. But when he saw the woman, Eva Caldwell, her eyes held not the defiance of a criminal, but the brittle stillness of the wrongly condemned. It was a look he knew, a look that clawed at him from a shallow grave in his past, a ghost from a case he'd botched, a mistake that had cost an innocent man everything. He'd sworn off the law, trading his badge for the quiet solitude of the range. He was just about to turn away when a small hand tugged his sleeve. "Eva's daughter." "Mister," she whispered, her voice a chilling secret. "Tomorrow. They're gonna hang my mommy." The child's words were not a whisper. They were a key turning a lock in a room inside him he had sealed shut 5 years ago. A room filled with ghosts. For a frozen moment, Sam McCoy saw nothing but the girl's impossibly wide eyes. The world returned in a rush of noise and dust. The auctioneer's call, the shifting of the crowd, the impatient lowing of cattle. The deputy was already there, gently but firmly pulling the child away from him, leading her back toward a grim-faced woman who must have been a relative. Grace Ann looked back, once her expression a silent, desperate plea. Sam turned before anyone could read the storm on his face. He nodded curtly to the clerk, his movement stiff automatic. He collected the lead rope for the Jersey cow, his knuckles white around the coarse hemp. He walked away from the auction, away from the courthouse, leading his new purchase. Any other man would have headed out of town back to the lonely quiet of the plains. But the girl's whisper was a hook in his soul. It snagged on the jagged edges of his own past failures. He did not leave. He led the cow to the livery stable at the edge of town, the smell of hay and horses, a small familiar comfort in a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. Just for the night, he told the stable boy, his voice a low rasp. He paid for a stall and a small airless room for himself above the stable. He was lying to the boy and to himself. He knew this was no longer about a single night. As twilight bled purple and orange across the sky, Sam found himself in the town's only saloon, the Golden Slipper. It was a place of splintered wood, low light, and the slow drowning of sorrows in cheap whiskey. He took a seat in the darkest corner, the brim of his hat a shield. He didn't want to talk. He wanted to listen. Justice and redemption was a thirsty thing, and it drank from a poisoned well. He needed to learn its taste. The talk was loose, fueled by beer and boredom. It circled inevitably around the next day's main event. Hanged at dawn, a grizzled miner slurred to his companion. "Serves her right, the black-hearted witch." "Poisoned old Miller's cattle," I heard the other replied, wiping foam from his mustache. And then Miller himself turns up dead a day later. Convenient, ain't it? Sam's ears pricked up. Cattle. The official story was coming into focus. He took a slow sip of his whiskey, the fire in his throat doing nothing to warm the ice in his gut. A third man, a blacksmith by the size of his arms, leaned in. That ain't the whole of it. Sheriff Kane found the bottle of strychnine hid in her root cellar. Open and shut case. Miller was going to testify against her for the cattle. She just silenced him first. Sam's mind, the cold, analytical machine he had tried so hard to shut down, began to work. It was too neat. Too perfect. A hanging sentence for poisoning cattle was unheard of. It had to be the murder. But a bottle of poison in a cellar, that wasn't proof. It was a plant. It was the kind of clumsy, arrogant evidence a man leaves when he controls the law and doesn't expect anyone to ask the right questions. He saw the ghost again, the face of the innocent man, the gallows against a pale morning sky. He had missed the planted evidence in that case, too. He had been too young, too eager, too trusting of the badge. He was no longer any of those things. He finished his whiskey, the glass making a sharp final sound as he set it down. He had heard enough. The story was a lie. He could smell the rot on it even from across the room. He rose and walked out into the cool night air, his purpose a cold, hard stone forming in his chest. He didn't get 5 steps before a shadow detached itself from the wall of the general store. Enjoying the town stranger. It was Sheriff Kane. He stood casually picking at his teeth with a splinter of wood, but his posture was as coiled as a rattlesnake. The starlight caught the edge of his badge, a tiny, cold fire. Just passing through, Sam said, his voice even. He kept his hands loose at his sides, away from the phantom weight of a gun he no longer wore. That's what they all say. Kane mused, his eyes dark and knowing roaming over Sam. He wasn't looking at a rancher. He was sizing up a threat. Funny thing about redemption, some folks who are just passing through find themselves staying longer than they planned. Sometimes they don't stay long enough. The threat was as sharp and clean as a razor's edge. Kane took a step closer, lowering his voice. That's a good cow you bought today. From a bad bloodline. A man could get himself sick messing with poison ivy. Best to take your livestock and ride on. The air here can be unhealthy for men with too much curiosity. He knew. Kane knew somehow that Sam was more than he appeared. He had seen the way Sam watched, the way he listened. Sam didn't rise to the bait. He simply nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. Sound advice, Sheriff. He walked away, feeling Kane's eyes on his back every step of the way. The game had been set. The warning had been delivered. He reached his small room above the livery. He didn't light the lamp. He stood by the grimy window, looking out over the moon-bleached square. In the center, 2 men were working by lantern light, erecting the stark, skeletal frame of the gallows. A dark tree, waiting for its strange and bitter fruit. The sun would rise in less than 8 hours. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small oilskin-wrapped bundle. His hand steady and sure unwrapped it. Inside was a small tarnished silver star, a U.S. Marshal's badge, a relic from another life. He held the cold metal in his palm, its weight a familiar ache. He had run from this. He had tried to bury it. But the ghost of his past had found him, and it was wearing a little girl's face. The sun would rise and a rope would demand its due, unless he could find a truth to sever it first. The moon was a cold silver coin in the vast velvet dark. It tracked the slow, agonizing crawl of time across the sky. From his window, Sam watched the gallows. It was finished now, a stark, hungry silhouette against the stars. A monument to the town's poisoned justice. He could ride away. The thought was a serpent coiling in the back of his mind. He could take his cow and his $22 and be miles away by sunrise, leaving the ghosts of redemption to their grim work. He had earned his solitude, paid for it with a piece of his own soul. But the girl's whisper had already cauterized that wound, reopening it. He could still feel the phantom clutch of her small hand on his sleeve. He strapped on his old gun belt. The leather was stiff from disuse, the holster empty, but the weight of it on his hips was a familiar burden. A promise. He didn't take the tarnished badge. A real lawman wouldn't need it tonight. And he was no longer a real lawman. He was something else. A ghost come to haunt the hangman. He moved through the back alleys, a shadow among shadows. The town slept a restless, guilty sleep. A dog barked, was shushed. Lamplight from a saloon window painted a sick yellow smear across the filth-strewn dirt. He moved with a quiet economy of motion, a skill he hadn't used in years but had never forgotten. The jailhouse was a squat stone box at the end of the main street, its windows barred and dark. A single lantern cast a weak, flickering glow over the front door. Sam circled to the back. A lone deputy sat tilted back in a chair by the entrance, boots up on the desk, the picture of bored authority. Sam didn't hesitate. He walked around to the front, his steps deliberate, crunching just enough on the gravel to announce his presence. The deputy startled, his chair thudding to the floor. He was a young man with a weak chin and eyes that held more weariness than malice. "Place is closed for the night, mister," the deputy mumbled, rubbing sleep from his face. Sam stepped into the light, letting it catch the hard lines of his face. He didn't smile. He didn't threaten. He projected an aura of absolute, unassailable authority, the kind that came from looking into the abyss and not flinching. "I'm here to see the prisoner," Sam said. It was not a request. The deputy puffed out his chest. "Sheriff's orders. No visitors. Especially not tonight." "Sheriff Kane works for the territory." Sam replied, his voice a low, cold current. "And the territory works for the United States government. I'm a federal marshal's son, and I have questions that won't wait for sunrise." He let the lie hang in the air, heavy and solid. He watched the boy's eyes, saw the flicker of doubt, the ingrained deference to a power greater than a small-town sheriff. The boy swallowed. He looked from Sam's cold, unwavering gaze to the darkness behind him, and his resolve crumbled. Yes, sir, Marshal. Right this way." The cell was a cage of cold stone and colder despair. Eva Caldwell sat on a narrow cot, her back to the wall. She didn't look up when the door creaked open. She seemed to have retreated into a place beyond hope, beyond fear. The lantern light from the hall carved her face from the shadows, a sculpture of hollowed-out grief. "You have 5 minutes, Marshal," the deputy said, already eager to return to his chair. He closed the barred door, the sound of the bolt sliding home, an echo of a tomb being sealed. Sam stood before her, the iron bars between them. "Your daughter found me," he said, his voice quiet in the heavy silence. "She told me you're innocent." Eva finally looked up. Her eyes were voids. "Does it matter?" she asked, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. This town needed a sinner. Sheriff Kane gave them one. The story is written. The rope is waiting. "Stories can be unwritten," Sam countered. She gave a short, bitter laugh. "By who, you a stranger who buys a condemned woman's cow? Are you here for a last confession to soothe your own conscience before you ride away?" Her distrust was a wall thick and high. He knew he couldn't climb it with empty promises. He had to tear it down with a piece of his own broken soul. He stepped closer to the bars, his hands gripping the cold iron. "I am here because of a man named Elias Thorne." He said the name, tasting like ash in his mouth. "I put him in a cage just like this one 5 years ago. The evidence was clean. A signed confession. A murder weapon with his prints. Sheriff said it was open and shut." He paused, the memory twisting in his gut. "I stood there. I watched them hang him." A week later, the real killer was caught in another state, boasted about the whole thing. The confession was coerced. The weapon was planted. The sheriff was paid off. He met her gaze, letting her see the raw, unhealed wound he carried. "I saw the same stillness in Thorne's eyes that I see in yours now. The look of a person who knows the truth doesn't matter when the lie is more convenient. I quit the marshals the next day. I came out here to bury that mistake, to be done with it." He leaned his forehead against the bars. "Your daughter?" She just dug it up. The silence that followed was different. The wall was gone. In its place was a fragile, trembling bridge of shared injustice. Tears, hot and silent, finally traced paths through the dust on Eva's cheeks. "My husband," she whispered, her voice cracking. "David. He wasn't a fighter. He was a good man, a careful man. He was a surveyor before we bought the ranch." Sam listened, his whole being focused. What did he find Eva? He and Miller were arguing about the property line, about the water from the creek. A week before he died, David was out there checking the lines. He came back late, his face pale. He said the creek didn't run right, that the maps were wrong. He said he found something that could ruin a man with a silver star. Hope, sharp and painful, pierced Sam's chest. Did he say what it was? Did he write it down? He always wrote everything down. She replied, a flicker of life returning to her eyes. In his surveying ledger, a small leather-bound book. Where is it? Sam pressed his voice urgent. I don't know, she said, her face falling. Kane's men tore the house apart after they arrested me. They took everything of value. Sam's mind raced. They took things of value. A ledger wouldn't be valuable to them unless they knew what was in it, which meant they hadn't found it. Think Eva. A place they wouldn't look. A place that's not valuable. She closed her eyes, her mind traveling back through the rooms of her stolen life. Her face suddenly went still. The nursery, she whispered. Grace Ann's room. In her toy box. He mended the false bottom himself. He always said, the safest place is in plain sight. Sam finished for her. He knew he had to go. The deputy was getting restless. I'll find it, he promised, his voice a low iron vow. He left her then, a single fragile flame of hope lit in the darkness of her cell. He walked out of the jailhouse, past the oblivious deputy, and back into the moon-drenched night. Dawn was a handful of hours away. The gallows waited for a body, but the truth was hiding in a dead man's book, nestled amongst a child's forgotten toys. He had to get to it first. The world had shrunk to a narrow path of moon-drenched dust. Behind Sam, the town of Redemption was a fading cluster of guilty lights. Ahead, the Caldwell homestead was a dark, jagged wound against the horizon. The gallows, even from this distance, was a constant nagging presence in his mind's eye, a stark promise that the night was finite. Every gust of wind seemed to whisper a single urgent word: hurry. He left the Jersey cow tethered in a hidden coulee, a silent living anchor to a life he might never return to. He approached the homestead on foot, moving through the sagebrush like a wraith. The house was not just empty, it felt violated. A skeleton picked clean by scavengers. The front door hung open on a single hinge, a broken jaw moaning softly in the breeze. Inside, the moonlight that streamed through the grimy windows revealed a scene of quiet chaos. Furniture was overturned. Drawers were pulled out, their contents strewn across the floor. They hadn't been searching for anything specific. They had been performing an act of desecration, erasing the memory of the family who had lived here. He felt it then, not just a lawman's drive, but a cold, personal rage. This was the work of a man who didn't just want to win, he wanted to annihilate. He found the nursery at the end of a short hall. The air here was different. It still held a faint lingering trace of innocence. A crudely drawn picture of a horse was tacked to the wall. A small empty bed sat in the corner, the linens rumpled. This was the heart of the home they had shattered. This was the reason he was here. The toy box was in the corner, its lid painted with faded, cheerful daisies. It seemed too small, too innocent to hold the key to a woman's life. Sam knelt the floorboards, groaning under his weight. He ran his hand along the inside, feeling for a seam, a catch, anything. For a sickening moment, he found nothing. Had she been mistaken? Had despair created a false memory? Then his fingers brushed against it. A slight unevenness in the wood at the front. A small, almost invisible notch. He pressed it. A section of the floor of the box clicked softly and lifted. It was there. The ledger was small, bound in dark, cracked leather, its pages filled with the tight, meticulous script of a man who believed in order. David Caldwell. A man who saw the world in lines and numbers, a logic that had ultimately gotten him killed. Sam carried it to the window, angling the book to catch the thin silver light. The first few pages were exactly as Eva had described: property lines, elevation markers, notes on water flow from the creek that bordered their land and Miller's. It was the careful work of a man building a life. Then the notes began to change. Sam's breath caught. David had started marking things that had nothing to do with surveying. He'd noted strange nighttime movements, unfamiliar cattle brands, trails that led not to ranches but to nowhere, to box canyons and abandoned mines. He was documenting the slow creeping rot he saw infecting the territory. He was building a different kind of map, a map of a criminal conspiracy. Sam's fingers, numb with a dawning dread, turned to the last page. Tucked into a leather sleeve was a folded piece of paper. He carefully pulled it out. It was a hand-drawn map of the entire region. Dotted lines crisscrossed it, showing the secret routes of a rustling operation, their hideouts, their schedules. It was a masterpiece of covert intelligence. And at the center of the web connecting all the lines, David Caldwell had drawn a spider. Inside the spider's body, he had written a single name followed by a stark, terrifying question mark. Sheriff B. Kane. It hit Sam with the force of a physical blow. Kane wasn't just a corrupt lawman covering up a single murder for a land grab. He was the kingpin. The rustling, the ambushes, the fear that gripped the territory. It all ran back to the man with the silver star. Miller hadn't been an innocent rival. He must have been part of Kane's operation, a weak link who had to be removed. David Caldwell hadn't stumbled onto a water dispute. He'd stumbled into the viper's nest. Framing Eva wasn't just convenient. It was the final perfect move to bury the truth forever. A floorboard creaked on the porch behind him. Sam didn't think. He reacted. He shoved the ledger inside his coat and spun away from the window, melting into the deepest shadows of the room, just as the front door was pushed fully open. Two figures entered, silhouetted against the night sky. Kane's deputies. "Told you the sheriff was just spooking," one of them grumbled. "Ain't nobody here. Just ghosts." "Sheriff pays us to watch, we watch the other," replied his voice hard. "Light the lamp. Let's make sure." Sam held his breath. He was trapped. The ledger felt like a block of ice against his ribs. It was the truth. It was life. And these men were here to extinguish it. As one deputy fumbled with a match, Sam moved. He wasn't a brawler, not anymore. He was a creature of strategy and silence. He picked up a small wooden stool, its legs uneven. He hurled it across the room into the far corner. It clattered loudly against the wall. "What was that?" the first deputy yelled, spinning toward the sound, his gun drawn. It was the opening Sam needed. As they focused on the noise, he bolted from the nursery through the main room and launched himself out the back door into the night. "There he is!" Stop. A gunshot exploded behind him, the bullet splintering the doorframe where his head had been a second before. He didn't look back. He ran plunging into the darkness of the open plains, the shouts and gunshots fading behind him. He ran with a fire in his lungs and ice in his veins, his injured ankle a dull, screaming throb. After what felt like an eternity, he risked a glance over his shoulder. There were no lights, no sounds of pursuit. He had lost them for now. He collapsed behind a rocky outcropping, his chest heaving, his body slick with sweat. He clutched the ledger to his chest. He had it. He had the truth. He looked east. A pale, sickly line of gray was beginning to separate the land from the sky. Dawn was coming, a slow, unstoppable bleed on the edge of the world. And in the town of Redemption, the hangman was making his final preparations. Dawn broke over Redemption not as a promise but as a threat. It was a cold, indifferent light that painted the eastern sky in shades of bruised purple and pale, bloodless gray. It crept over the rooftops, slid down the alleyways, and finally touched the stark, hungry frame of the gallows in the center of the square. A crowd had gathered, their faces pale and watchful in the morning chill. They were here for the final act of the town's grim play, Ava Caldwell was led from the jailhouse. She walked with a quiet, hollowed-out dignity, her hands bound. She did not look at the crowd. She did not look at the gallows. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon, on the memory of a life that was now just a fading echo. She thought of Grace Ann, and a single tear, hot and sharp, traced a path through the dust on her cheek. It was her only act of defiance. Sheriff Kane stood on the platform, a black-clad arbiter of fate. His face was a mask of grim satisfaction. He had won. The stranger from yesterday was gone, the evidence was buried, and his perfect, brutal order was about to be restored. He let the silence stretch, savoring his power, his control. "People of redemption," he began, his voice ringing with false piety, "we are gathered here today to uphold the law, to cleanse our community of a poison that crept in amongst us. Justice is a hard thing, but it is a necessary thing." He nodded to the hangman, a hulking hooded figure. He looked at Eva, who was now standing on the trap door, the coarse rope, a final brutal necklace around her throat. "Let this be a lesson," Kane declared, "that no crime will go unpunished, and this town's crimes have gone unpunished for too long, Kane." The voice cut through the air like a bullwhip. It came from the edge of the crowd. Sam McCoy stood there, his clothes torn, his face streaked with grime and exhaustion, but his eyes burned with a righteous fire. He held a leather-bound book in his hand, holding it up like a shield. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Kane's face went rigid, a flicker of shock quickly replaced by pure fury. "Seize him!" Kane roared at his deputies. "He's an accomplice, an outlaw." The deputies moved, but the crowd, now captivated, did not part so easily. "An outlaw," Sam's voice boomed, turning not to Kane but to the townspeople. "I'm the only lawman this town has seen in years. You came to see a murderer hang, but you're about to watch a victim die at the hands of the man who killed her husband." "Lies, Kane," bellowed, his composure cracking. "He's a madman, am I?" Sam shot back, taking a step forward. He held the ledger high. This was David Caldwell's ledger. He wasn't a poisoner. He was a surveyor. And he surveyed your sheriff's soul. He mapped every bit of its rotten terrain. He flipped open the book. His voice, a hammer striking anvils of truth. August 9th, 20, head of cattle driven from the Miller Ranch not by raiders but west to the Shadow Canyon holdout September 3rd, a payroll wagon hit the trail deliberately diverted by a patrol led by Deputy Hanks. It's all here. The routes, the hideouts, the payouts. He fixed his gaze on the two deputies who had hunted him. Ask them where they were last night. They weren't patrolling. They were at the Caldwell homestead trying to kill me to stop me from finding this book. The crowd erupted in murmurs. Doubt, a far more potent poison than strychnine, began to spread. The deputies faltered, their eyes darting from Sam to Kane, their loyalty fracturing. They were lawmen, but the man holding the proof spoke with the authority of a higher law. Kane saw it in their faces. He was losing them. His kingdom built on fear and lies was crumbling, his face contorted into a mask of pure, snarling desperation. If he couldn't control the story, he would end it. He drew his Colt. But he didn't aim at Sam. He aimed at Eva. The world slowed. Sam saw the flick of Kane's wrist, the glint of the barrel, the final desperate act of a tyrant. Sam's own gun was in his hand before he was even aware of drawing it. The sound of his shot was a single definitive crack that shattered the morning. It was not a killing shot. It was a lawman's shot. The bullet tore through Kane's wrist, sending his pistol flying. He howled a sound of animal pain and fury. It was the signal. Chaos erupted. Two deputies loyal to the last opened fire on Sam. But another, his face pale with revelation, turned his gun on his former comrades. The town square became a whirlwind of smoke and shouting. Sam ignored the crossfire. His focus was on one man. He moved through the chaos, closing the distance to the gallows. Cain, clutching his shattered wrist, fumbled for another gun with his left hand. Sam stopped a few feet from him, his pistol steady. Their eyes met. The rancher and the hangman. The ghost and the tyrant. "It's over," Cain Sam said, his voice cold as a grave. Cain spat a wad of blood in fury. You're nobody." "I'm the man who remembers," Sam replied. And he fired. The shot was final. Sheriff Cain crumpled to the floor of the gallows, his reign of terror ending in the dust at the feet of the woman he had framed. Silence fell absolute and profound. The gun smoke slowly cleared, revealing the tableau. Cain was dead. His loyal deputies were down. The town stood frozen, staring. And on the gallows, Eva Caldwell stood still, alive, the noose hanging loosely around her neck. Sam stood in the center of it all, the smoking gun in one hand, the dead man's book in the other. He had brought the truth. He had served justice, but he had also destroyed the law in redemption. He looked at the shocked faces of the townspeople, at the woman on the gallows, at the dawn sky. And for the first time he had no idea what came next. The last echo of the gunshot faded, leaving a silence that was heavier than any sound. It was a glass bell, fragile and absolute, descending upon the town square of Redemption. The townsfolk stood frozen, a gallery of shocked statues staring at the wreckage of their law. The body of Sheriff Cain lay sprawled on the gallows he had built, a monument to his own spectacular ruin. For a long moment, Sam McCoy did not move. He stood in the center of the chaos, the smoking gun in his hand, a stark counterpoint to the leather-bound ledger clutched in the other. He had been a force of nature, a storm of righteous fury that had swept through the town. Now in the quiet aftermath, he was just a man breathing in the scent of gunpowder and finality. His gaze lifted from the dead sheriff to the living woman. Eva Caldwell stood on the trapdoor, her body trembling, her eyes fixed on him. The noose, thick and obscene, still hung around her neck. Sam moved. He walked up the wooden steps of the gallows, each footfall a heavy, deliberate sound in the stillness. He ignored the bodies of the deputies, the scattered guns, the wide, staring eyes of the crowd. He walked directly to Eva. He didn't speak. He simply reached out, and his hands calloused and sure worked at the knot of the rope. He loosened it carefully, lifting the hateful loop over her head and casting it aside. It coiled in the dust like a dead snake. "It's over," he said, his voice a low, rough thing meant only for her. He offered a hand. She took it, her fingers cold as ice. As he helped her down from the platform, a cry pierced the silence. Mama Grace Ann tore through the parting crowd, a small, desperate cannonball of love and relief. She crashed into Eva, her small arms wrapping around her mother's waist, her face burying itself in the worn fabric of her dress. Eva collapsed to her knees, her own arms enveloping her daughter in a fierce, protective embrace, her body shaking with silent, racking sobs. It was the sound of a world being put back together. Sam stood over them, a silent guardian. He watched the reunion, and the ghost that had haunted him for 5 long years, the ghost of the man he failed to save, finally, quietly began to fade. He hadn't erased his past mistake. But here in the cold light of a new day, he had balanced the ledger of his own soul. An old man with a weathered face, the town's hardware store owner and unofficial mayor, stepped forward from the crowd. He stopped before Sam, twisting his hat in his hands. "You," the old man began, his voice shaky. "You brought a terrible reckoning to this town, mister. But it was a truth we were too cowardly to see for ourselves." He gestured to the dead sheriff. "He was our law. Now we have nothing. You had nothing before," Sam said, his voice flat. "You had a wolf guarding the henhouse." "Maybe so," the elder conceded. He bent down and picked up the silver star from Cain's dusty vest. He wiped it clean on his shirt, the gesture slow and deliberate. He held it out to Sam. "But a town needs a law, a real one. It needs a man who isn't afraid of the truth." The star lay in the old man's palm, gleaming dully. It was an offer, a plea, a sentence. Sam looked at the badge, and his first instinct was to recoil. He had thrown one just like it into a river years ago, swearing an oath of solitude. "I'm not a lawman," he said, the words feeling thin and false even to him. "I just came here for a cow." The old man's gaze did not waver. "The town needs you." Sam's eyes drifted to Eva and Grace Ann. Eva had risen to her feet, her daughter still clinging to her. She was watching him, her expression full of a fragile, burgeoning hope that was more terrifying and more compelling than any threat he had ever faced. He had come to this town to be left alone. He had sought an ending, a quiet fading into the dust. But a child's whisper had demanded a new beginning. Slowly, he reached out. He took the badge from the old man's hand. It was not a prize. It was an anchor, pulling him back to a world he had tried to flee, back to a duty he could no longer deny. That afternoon the sun was warm and gentle. The gallows were gone, dismantled by the silent, ashamed hands of the townsmen. Sam stood with Eva and Grace Ann at the edge of the Caldwell property. He handed the leather ledger back to her. "This belongs to you," he said. "It's the story of a good man." Eva took it, her fingers brushing his. "He would have liked you," she said softly. Grace Ann looked up at the new silver star pinned to Sam's coat. "Are you going to stay, Mr. McCoy?" she asked, her voice clear and bright. "Are you going to be our sheriff?" Sam looked from the child's hopeful face to her mother's. Eva was smiling a true and genuine smile that reached her eyes, chasing away the last of the shadows. It was a smile that promised quiet evenings, shared burdens, and the building of a new life. A life he realized he desperately wanted. "I reckon I am," Sam said. And for the first time in a very long time he smiled back. The future was an unwritten page, but it no longer felt like a threat. It felt like coming home.